first time, the leading candidates in the Louisiana race for governor take to the stage in a live televised debate. In one of the most important contests of the year, each of them will weigh in on the issues that matter the most to you. Live from the heart of New Orleans, inside Studio B at WDSU. This is Commitment 2015, the race for governor. Now, your moderator, Scott Walker.
Good evening and welcome to our viewers tonight across the state. Please join me in welcoming the candidates to the stage. We ask the audience to hold your applause as we introduce the candidates. You will have an opportunity to applaud in just a moment. Reverend Jeremy Odom, an independent from Natchitoches, is a U.S. Army veteran, a Baptist minister, and a tax consultant. Republican Public Service Commissioner Scott Angel from Breaux Bridge is a former lieutenant governor. State Representative John Bell Edwards, the Democrat from Amite, is the current minority leader of the Louisiana House of Representatives. Senator David Vitter, the Republican from Metairie, is currently the senior U.S. Senator from Louisiana. Lieutenant Governor Jay Darden, a Republican from Baton Rouge, is a former Louisiana Secretary of State. Democrat Carrie Deaton is an attorney from Metairie who has worked as an assistant district attorney in New Orleans. Gentlemen, welcome.
Thank you.
None of the candidates tonight have received the questions in advance. Here are the rules and the format now. There will be no opening statements. Each candidate will have a defined time up to 1 minute to respond to the questions and up to 30 seconds for any rebuttals. There will be 1 minute for closing statements from each of the candidates. We also ask the audience to hold reaction and applause during the debate, except for right now. Please welcome the 6 candidates who have joined us tonight, each of whom wants to be Louisiana's next governor. And we invite you to participate in the conversation, of course, on Twitter and Facebook. You can use the hashtag WDSU debate. Again, that'll work on Facebook and Twitter. First tonight, a topic that's generated a lot of conversation nationally. A court clerk in Kentucky ignited a national debate recently when she cited her personal religious beliefs and refused to issue marriage licenses to same-sex couples in her county. Her actions elevated the debate that followed a Supreme Court ruling requiring states to provide gay couples with the same marriage benefits as others. So now, with a show of hands, gentlemen, do you believe Kim Davis, as an elected official tasked with such responsibility, has the right to withhold marriage licenses based on personal religious convictions? Okay, Senator Vitter first. Would you feel the same if a clerk of court declined to issue a license to an interracial couple citing personal beliefs involving separation of races?
No, I wouldn't, Scott, but I think this goes to the core of some of our fundamental values as a nation: religious freedom, religious liberty. And we've always had the tradition in America of giving great leeway to allow folks to pursue their religious beliefs and practice as they choose. There were multiple ways this issue could have been solved without putting that clerk of court in jail. That judge in Kentucky went out of his way to make a spectacle of her and to jail her when there would have been multiple ways that she was absolutely open to allow those marriage certificates to be issued by others in her office, others in Kentucky, without making her, forcing her, essentially putting a gun to her head to violate her closely held and sincerely held religious beliefs. So in this country, I think we make those accommodations, particularly when they would not disadvantage in any way any of the couples involved.
Okay, thank you. State Representative Edwards, you did not raise your hand, the only one among the group. What are your thoughts?
Well, I don't believe anyone is free to deny those marriage licenses once the Supreme Court says the Constitution requires them to be issued. Now, if she doesn't want to personally issue those licenses, I'm fine with that. But someone in her office has to be in a position to issue those licenses. I took an oath to the Constitution as an Army officer. It's the same oath that I take now as a legislator and the same oath I'll take as the next governor. Now, my personal religious views are informed by my Catholic Christian faith, and that is that marriage is between a man and a woman. But this issue has been taken up by the Supreme Court. They've made a decision, and we're not free to ignore that decision. Anarchy would result if that happened. So the question for us now is, how do we go forward in the United States of America and nobody gets discriminated against? I believe that people ought to be free to practice their religion. That's why in 2010 I supported and voted for the Preservation of Religious Freedom Act in Louisiana, giving religious institutions and individuals the strongest possible protections in the law.
Thank you, State Representative Edwards. Commissioner Angel, is it okay to disregard what the Supreme Court says, in your view?
I believe our political freedoms are only as strong as our religious freedoms, and certainly I believe the law can always make accommodations for folks like the clerk in Kentucky. The reality of it all is the clerk made other folks in her office available to do that. I certainly believe that folks ought to be able to have strongly held religious beliefs in America and ought to be able to live by those religious beliefs. One of the main foundations of our country are those strongly held religious beliefs. So I certainly support the county clerk there, and I do believe as long as she is making accommodations for folks in her office to provide that service, that's okay in America, and it's an easy thing for us to do.
Lieutenant Governor Darden, is that okay in America?
Well, to answer your first question, it's not the same standard, I don't believe, for an interracial couple. But I think this is going to be, we're on the cusp of a great debate that's going to take place in America as we go forward with this issue. And I think there has to be tolerance involved on both sides of this issue. And I think it's going to be a balancing act for states and for courts as we go forward, trying to decide that balance between what the Supreme Court has declared to be constitutional and the religious freedoms that we enjoy in this country and the ability of people to worship as they please. And I think there were other alternatives available. I don't think putting this lady in jail was the right response. She could be mandamus, that is ordered to do this, or have someone in her office do it, and that's what ultimately resulted from it. I think the notion of placing her in jail because of her religious beliefs is not the answer, and I don't think we ought to be doing that going forward.
Mr. Odom.
Well, I believe firmly that anybody in America has the right to exercise freedom of religion. For the I do not believe, however, that the Supreme Court has the legal authority to say that same-sex marriage is legal. But they did, and that's something that we have to live with. But to jail this clerk for not issuing licenses, I don't believe that was necessary.
Mr. Deaton.
Well, certainly, let me say I'm an attorney, so I'm obligated in a way to follow what the U.S. Supreme Court says. However, I followed this controversy on television a good bit, and I observed that Ms. Davis and her attorneys did not quite have the legal structure to support freedom of religion and freedom of or separation of church and state. There needs to be more case law developed so that those who favor traditional marriages can stand up to the activism, if you will, of the other side.
Scott, if I can respond to
Sure.
Representative Edwards.
You have 30 seconds.
I don't think there's any chance of anarchy. I don't think there's any chance of opposing the Supreme Court. What we're talking about is giving people, including elected officials, their religious freedoms, reasonable accommodations to do that. I have a specific chapter in my plan, Together Louisiana Strong, about standing up, fighting for religious freedoms, standing up, fighting for Louisiana values like life. I invite folks to go to davidvitter.com, go to those specifics. I'll be a leader on this, standing up for those Louisiana values.
Thank you, Senator. Would you like to respond?
Well, sure. The question wasn't, as I understood it, whether she should have been jailed. It was whether she had the right to deny a license that the Supreme Court said that her office had to issue. And she went to jail precisely because no one in her office was issuing. Once she agreed to the accommodation, she got out of jail and everything has been fine. I too believe that people ought to be granted accommodations, but as I understood your question, that was not part of it.
Okay, thank you, gentlemen. Another story that's been in the national news for far too long. Reverend Odom, we'll begin with you on this question. News today that rocked our country. Several people killed, numerous others injured at a community college in Oregon earlier. There have been other mass shooting incidents nationally, and certainly the one here in Louisiana that we're all too familiar with, the theater shooting in Lafayette in July. Are you satisfied with the current laws regarding background checks and the type of weapons that may be sold? You have 1 minute.
Well, the people that are doing these shootings aren't going through the background check. They're the ones that are having to abide by these strenuous requirements. It's the law-abiding citizens that have to deal with going through the background checks and the legal issue of gun ownership. So I don't necessarily say I believe in the laws that are in place right now, because the Constitution grants every American a right to bear arms.
Commissioner Angel, are you satisfied with the current laws regarding background checks and the type of weapons that may be sold?
I am. I strongly believe in the Second Amendment to the Constitution of the United States of America. I certainly believe that we ought not make it more difficult for law-abiding citizens to have access to their constitutional rights. The only way I believe you meet a bad person with a gun is a good person with a gun. And when I take a look at the issue in Lafayette, what I see is a situation where law enforcement responded in an appropriate way. I certainly do not believe that we ought to make it more difficult for law-abiding citizens to have access to guns. Now, I do believe that in Louisiana we need to take a look at some mental health issues. And what I've said very clearly is that within 180 days I will require on my desk a regional assessment of all of our mental illness services that we provide, whether it be law enforcement, our charities, or any number of local governments. I think if we do this on a regional basis, we can have a response that is appropriate, but certainly not taking guns away from law-abiding citizens.
Thank you, Commissioner Angel. State Representative Edwards, I imagine you may have a unique perspective on this, coming from a family with a long line of public service and 4 generations of sheriffs in your family. So what is your belief on this issue?
Well, as we gather here tonight, I don't think we yet know whether this individual who committed this senseless tragedy, and certainly my thoughts and prayers go out to the family and the friends of these victims, we don't know whether he had a criminal record or whether he had mental illness, whether he should have passed a background check or whether he did, or whether he legally obtained the firearm. I can only tell you the Second Amendment means what it says, and it says what it means. Individuals in the United States of America have a right to keep and bear arms. Now, having said that, we have to make sure that we have adequate safeguards in place so that individuals who are a threat to themselves or others by virtue of their criminal history or by mental illness cannot pass a background check. If the current and proper information is not being put into the database, then that is a real problem. So we have to make sure that the background check is a meaningful control to prevent individuals who should not get these weapons from getting them, and we can prevent a lot of senseless tragedy if we will just do that.
All right, Senator Vitter, again, if we've lost track of the question, are you satisfied with the laws regarding background checks and the type of weapons that may be sold?
I'm not satisfied with practice as it involves folks with real mental issues and as it involves criminals. I'm satisfied with regard to law-abiding citizens. Look, first of all, let's remember the tragedy that just occurred. Let's remember the victims and their families. I know we're all praying for them, certainly Wendy and me included. And secondly, we need to understand the facts of that case so we can respond. But clearly, I think where we should start is focused on individuals with serious mental issues like the Lafayette shooter, and focus on felons and criminals who shouldn't have guns for the rest of their lives, and that's the law. I support that. We don't do that effectively enough. With regard to law-abiding citizens, I'm glad my colleagues support Second Amendment rights, say that they do profess that. I'm the only candidate here who's earned an A+ from the NRA. I'm the only candidate here who's earned an A+ from Gun Owners of America. I have that proven record that will never change.
Lieutenant Governor Darden, what does that proven record mean to you?
Well, it doesn't mean a whole lot to me on his record, certainly, but I think I'm satisfied with the gun laws that we have, and I think they're appropriate. I've been talking about mental health issues before the tragedy in Lafayette and before the tragedies that we faced all across America. I'm tired of this issue being politicized, frankly, by our president every time something happens. But what we need to focus on in Louisiana and really all across the country is more mental health evaluation, treatment opportunities, and alternatives. We don't need an evaluation of everything that we have in Louisiana, Scott. I think we know that. We have that. We've got to try and start implementing an evaluation program for law enforcement officials, a training session for them to identify addictive disorders, mental health trigger points that would make them cognizant of the fact that someone's got an issue. So we don't go put them in jail, put them away, costing taxpayers more money. It's not fair to those individuals who have diseases, mental health or addictive disorders. We're not providing them adequate treatment, and we certainly don't want the taxpayers putting people in jail for nonviolent offenses, and that's what's happening. We're going to see more and more of unstable mental patients, unfortunately, committing these type of acts, but the answer is not more laws to prevent law-abiding citizens from having guns.
And Mr.